I'd like to welcome you to the second night of lectures of the National Affairs Institute and remind you all to pick up one of these yellow brochures if you haven't picked up one already. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the lectures that are going to be going on tomorrow so you can plan your day. At 3 o'clock in the gallery of the Union, Mary Helen Dunlop will be speaking on Frosting the Cupcakes Pink. Those big circulation, slick ladies magazines tell us how it is to be a woman. And I really think that will be a quite interesting lecture. Then at 8 o'clock in the evening, right here in the sunroom, there's going to be a panel on the comics with David Manning White, whom some of you heard last night, Arthur Berger, and Stan Lee. Tonight, we're going to hear about dramatic form and social reality in the American film by Steve Zito from the American Film Institute of Washington, D.C. Mr. Zito told us that he's never been to Iowa before, and he was hoping that it would be cold and snowy, but we disappointed him with a nice spring day, but hopefully a warm audience. Thank you.
I'd like to say first that you've been lured here slightly under false pretenses. It says in the program that I'm going to discuss contemporary naturalism in American films when that's not exactly true. I'm merely going to talk about realism, primarily realism, in the American film. It's going to be my intention to show a few films and parts of films and to outline ways in which these films might be of use to the social and cultural historian. The films are quite obscure. They have in fact been chosen because they are unimportant as artworks and insignificant in the history of film. The topic I have chosen is, I realize, somewhat vague and grandiose. It was chosen long before I had written the paper I'm about to deliver and was designed to provide an umbrella under which I could talk about certain films and argue against certain reductive and simplistic approaches to film, approaches that often get in the way of the proper use of motion pictures in historical and cultural studies. Americans have sometimes been accused of having and cultivating no sense of the past, but rather of being absorbed in the pursuit of money and machine progress. We have been thought to be a nation little disposed to ponder where it has come from and at what cost. The recent vogue for the old would at first seem to contradict this notion. We are inundated with a flood of revivals and reprints of old movies, comic strips, pulp magazines, dime novels, and the like. But it can be argued that this wholesale reissue of the past creates a false perspective on past time by emphasizing the superficial aspects of that time, the peculiar jargon, fashions, fads, furniture, and follies. It is an approach to popular culture that emphasizes the trivial and sets out to create the impression that yesterday was somehow a better and simpler time. At best, this approach turns up some interesting ephemera. At its worst, it leads to a camp or buff sensibility that celebrates the superficial and the absurd, that only dwells upon the vanished pleasures of the available past. At this time, I am going to show the first two of the 5 short films that I have brought along. For the sake of clarity, I'll give a little information about them. The first film is a promotional reel for MASH. It is immediately followed by a silent Gaumont newsreel that has been tentatively dated by internal evidence as being from the fall of 1920.
I think the younger audience that sees this picture is going to think it's Vietnam.
And I had considered cutting it to just one or two of its episodes, but I thought that it should be preserved in its staggering plentitude. A remarkable number of non-events occur in that newsreel. Perhaps the most obvious characteristic shared by these very different films is that they are not, in any sense, the work of artists. Both MASH and the Gaumont newsreel fail as means of knowing the past, and they fail for very different reasons. As the promotional film for MASH indicates, MASH is a film about the Korean War that was manufactured by people with very different sensibilities than those of filmmakers in 1952. Robert Altman, the director of the film, is a man of distinctly modern attitudes and beliefs. And as a result, MASH, however amusing and brutal in its sense of war as insanity, to use Altman's own word, is not valid as a reconstruction of the past. It is not a film from 1952, but rather a film that reflects a late 60s attitude toward the events of the Korean War. If we are to look for films about the 50s attitude toward the Korean War, we need look no further than war films like Fuller's Fixed Bayonets or The Steel Helmet, or another war film by Tay Garnett called 1 Minute to Zero. The final sequence of that film involves Robert Mitchum's justification of his decision to bomb a column of refugee women and children because some communist soldiers had taken refuge among them. This extreme statement of anti-communist feeling, so typical of the time, is valid documentation, while MASH, written incidentally by Ring Lardner Jr., who was blacklisted for his supposed leftist sympathies, is a Korean War film, is the Korean War seen through a glass darkly. The Gaumont news film is also inadequate as a means of knowing the past. Of the 12 episodes in the newsreel, there is very little that is not merely superficial illustration of what is already known from other and better sources, still photographs, books, newspapers, and other records of the way things were. The living pictures of Lillian Russell and Eddie Rickenbacker are useful, of course, but the events in which they are participating are so structured that their dress and movements tell us little that is not already known. And were one to look for a political non-event, Russell's visit to Des Moines looks like it was filmed in a closet. It is as disappointing as the shots of pudgy Edward Hardy Jr. Not only does this sequence about Hardy not tell us anything about the tensions and problems of a 12-year-old boy at Columbia University, but the phony staged outdoor scenes of him reading Horace are framed so that the film is not even a decent record of the way Morningside Heights looked on a sunny day in 1920. Perhaps the one item of real interest in the entire news film is the final sequence in the New Orleans convent, run by the black nuns. The episode is disappointing in that it does not show more of the real nature of school life, but it is interesting in that it shows black women in meaningful and dignified roles. This film takes on a special meaning when it is viewed within the past history of the Negro in films. The Negro traditionally has had but 3 roles to play: the savage, the fool, and the servant. And the Negro actor in playing these roles has less inhabited them than been inhibited by them. Black character has been dictated by popular stereotypes, and these stereotypes have been created out of a few histrionic elements: the rolled eye, the shuffled step, the molasses slow, stumble-tongued pattern of speech, the razor in the torn pocket, and the watermelon grin. As Stanley Cavell has noted in The World Viewed, until recently, types of black human beings were not created in film. We were not given, nor were we in a position to be given, individualities that projected particular ways of inhabiting a social role. We recognized only the role. I had wanted at this point in my talk to show a piece of a silent film that was made specifically for black audiences. Unfortunately, there's not time to do that, but I did want to speak briefly about the fact that there has been production of film in this country that was specifically designed for black audiences and that was quite different from the Hollywood product. The history of the Negro in the American film is more extensive and varied than has been until recently either known or cared about. The traditional narrow roles and racist themes in Hollywood films have been a matter of record and common knowledge. There were films made outside of Hollywood, however, films in which Negro life and character were presented in a favorable and even heroic light. These films were made with all-black casts and were intended for showing in the almost 500 movie houses that were for colored only. The films were made quickly and cheaply by independent companies, occasionally operated with black capital, and they are not much in the way of art. They are, however, generally entertaining and full of the myths and surfaces of a previous generation of black Americans. The first company producing all-black features for the ethnic market was the Lincoln Motion Picture Company, founded in 1918. The company stayed in existence for several years and made 5 films, none of which seemed to exist. The American Film Institute, however, has acquired and preserved a black silent feature, The Scar of Shame, that was produced by the Colored Players Film Corporation of Philadelphia in the mid-20s. The actors in the films were black. The producer, Sherman H. Dudley, was a Negro comedian who worked primarily in vaudeville. The director of the film was a white journeyman director who learned his trade as a cameraman. The Scar of Shame is a carbon copy of a genre, society melodrama, that was turned out by the gross in the Hollywood studios of the 20s. What gives the film its great interest is that the story has been filled out and translated into the terms of Negro life. The film was partly filmed on location in the Philadelphia suburbs, but more interesting than its rare glimpses of middle-class Negro life are the fantasies and longings expressed in the film. The plot features adultery, rape, murder, prison breaks, but the film is really not about these things at all. It is rather a study in caste and class and color among black people who are torn between their passions and the desire to be respectable. And as is so often the case in black films, the good people in the story are light-skinned and the bad people are dark-complected. This color keying is a form of visible shorthand, a means of immediately identifying those with whom the audience is supposed to be in sympathy. The story revolves around an uneducated, dark-skinned girl who forces into marriage an upright, middle-class piano teacher. The film ends with the suicide of the woman, and nowhere is black self-destructiveness more clearly traced to the longing for a whiteness that can never be achieved. The Scar of Shame expresses in the most poignant manner the needs of the black woman to find acceptance and status in a milieu where class was a matter of color as much as a matter of money or education. At this point, I am going to take a break and show 2 more films. Both of them are silent, and I again apologize for the lack of a musical accompaniment. Both of the films were directed by D.W. Griffith. Both of them star Mary Pickford, and both are quite interesting for what they reveal about American yesterdays. The first is a comedy, Muggsy's First Sweetheart, that was made in 1910. The second is a melodrama called A Beast at Bay that was made in 1912. A good deal more succinct than those titles were. As might be expected of the work of a man operating within industrial demands and the audience expectations of a popular art, Griffith's early films vary widely in quality. Several of them are good enough to warrant discussion as works of art. Others of them are obviously potboilers, lurid, sensational stories done with little care for story or acting. The general quality of the films, however, is quite good and gives an indication why they were so popular at the time of their first release and why they were so well received by critics at the time. By 1912, Griffith had begun to impose unity and meaning on the materials of his chosen art. It is quite possible to speak of certain of Griffith's films in terms of authorship and to look for evidence in them of his distinctive signature. In the words of the painter Redon, Griffith had begun to put the logic of the visible at the service of the invisible. As seen in A Beast at Bay, Griffith's films are extremely violent. There is a remarkable incidence of kidnapping, murder, attempted rape, robbery, theft, bootlegging, and the like. These crimes were, of course, a staple of dime novels and stage melodrama, so Griffith and his contemporary directors by no means introduced them to popular art. Griffith did, however, use them obsessively, and this use suggests that Griffith's conception of his society was that it was one in which there was a great conflict between the forces of order and disorder. Griffith's films can be best understood against the background of social change in the first years of this century. One of the best indications of this is the high incidence of violent crime directed against innocent and unprotected victims. All of this violence might be put down to the fact that Americans are a violent people who are accustomed to settling differences with a gun. But I think that this is to neglect the fact that the popular arts of other times and places have also been marked by acts of aggression. What is noticeable about these crimes in Griffith's films is the context in which they occur. Evildoers and their innocent, unsuspecting victims generally confront each other suddenly and unexpectedly. The shock of this confrontation is increased by the fact that it generally occurs between people whose ways of life and places of abode have no normal or logical connection with one another. One of the compelling things about these films is not that crime occurs for the ordinary reasons, revenge, anger, fear, or greed, but that it generally occurs between people who do not know each other before the moment of the crime. People become the victims of crime or violence by accident or chance or fate. The profound connection between the sense of social disorder in Griffith and in his audience can be partly explained by reference to contemporary conditions. It has been noted that morality breaks down under two conditions: rapid social change and contact with another alien way of life. Both of these conditions were present in the first years of this century. Massive immigration of peoples of different cultures and languages that changed the face and fate of this country occurred at the same time as the nation's population became predominantly urban and its economy primarily industrial. The tensions of the period are well summarized in Samuel Hayes' book, The Response to Industrialism, in which he writes, "For the millions of people torn from accustomed rural patterns of culture and thrust into a strange urban environment, the meaning of industrialism lay in a feeling of uprootedness, in the disintegration of old ways of life and the loss of familiar surroundings. Those left behind on the farms experienced the new forces through the expansion of urban culture and its threat to the nation's agrarian traditions." The violent connections in Griffith's films can thus be understood not only as the heritage of melodrama, but also as acts that have a symbolic meaning beyond their place within the narrative structure. Thus, violent acts become a metaphor for social disorder, social change, and social breakdown. At the most simple level of use to the historian, the biograph films, like almost all films, provide certain information about how things look, about how things are done, and about what is imagined to be taking place in the social world at a given time and place. This use of film as record was anticipated by art historian Clive Bell in 1913 when he wrote, "With the perfection of photographic processes and of the cinematograph, who doubts that one of those Daily Mirror photographers, in collaboration with a Daily Mail reporter, can tell us far more about life day by day than any royal academician. For an account of manners and fashions, we shall go in the future to photographs." At this most simple level, film records the surface and the superficial fantasies of the past. Film is capable, however, of preserving much more than the surfaces of reality. It can also preserve something of the experiential wholeness of any given period in time. Seen this way, Mugsy's First Sweetheart is, first, a film of record, a series of moving images that document clothes, manners, furnishing, and morals of another time. It preserves for us something of the way the little town of Westfield, New Jersey looked on the 20th day of May, 1910. I happen to have lived near Westfield for a couple of years, and the few glimpses of the town's main street in the film give evidence, if any is needed, of the brutal, rapid effacement of the American past. A film like Mugsy's First Sweetheart, by transfixing this past, puts us in touch with our former selves. The film is also, as I have said, a record of manners and morals. The social reformers and do-gooders in the film, the uplifters, are mocked and condemned for their lack of human warmth and feeling. Griffith may have been a Victorian sentimentalist, but there is no doubt that he disapproved of those who opposed books and new hats and nude statues with unfeeling, callow rigidity. Films like Mugsy's First Sweetheart are extremely didactic in nature, as were many others of Griffith's films. The following are typical comments on representative Griffith films that were released around 1912. One was called A Story with a Moral, and it is clearly brought out. Another was said to illustrate to us in a refreshingly pleasing and in a not too plain way the well-recognized truth that our home is the best for us and also our own lot in life. Another reviewer spoke about the pleasing quality of this picture comes largely from its moral purpose. And finally, here is another tract. It deals, as all good tracts must, with a homely, simple, and very human situation and presents it to us very effectively. It is almost universal in its appeal. The man gets a sharp lesson and profits by it. Griffith himself was well aware of this element in his work, writing, "I believe in the motion picture not only as a means of amusement, but as a moral and educational force." The lessons in the Biograph films, however, are more than simple homilies, for the very nature of most of the films makes them vehicles for certain ideas and moral precepts that are repeated over and over. The triumph of the weak, pride brought low, the reward of the modest, the success of the unpromising or beleaguered hero, and many other themes common to folk literature and the popular arts. One of the most common of these didactic elements repeated from film to film, and one that I think is evident in Mugsy's First Sweetheart, is that of the virtue of contentment, that of happiness with what one has and with one's place in life. It is significant that the Griffith biographs are not little tales from the notebooks of Horatio Alger. The success of the Griffith hero is achieved by the maintenance of the status quo, and not from personal advancement or falling heir to windfall luck. His films deal with the satisfactions of life, the pleasure of friends, children, and the home. There is in his films a holistic sense of relatedness to neighbors, nature, and God. Griffith's morality tales preach honesty, mercy, and love, and these terms were understood by Griffith and by his audience in terms largely based on Christian ethics. It is this sense of the goodness and wholeness of life that makes the sudden intrusion of violence and greed so disturbing in Griffith's films. It is as if the tension in the films between good and evil reflected the tension in Griffith between what he believed about life, its goodness, and what he knew about the world in which he lived and worked, the facts of crime, unemployment, race conflict, conflict between strikers and the police, growing urban poverty. Griffith was a badly divided man, and as the world changed more and more after the First World War, Griffith found himself more and more out of touch with his audience. The moral quality of the Griffith imaginative universe can be clearly seen in the visual aspects of the films. The scale of the films is human, for they are primarily shot from eye level. The principle of composition is to order and to dignify landscapes and interiors alike. There is in them an unbroken continuity between man and nature. The landscapes in the films are idyllic, unrestrained, benign, full of air and light. Griffith himself was acutely sensitive to the expressive possibilities of light. He once wrote of Cuddebackville, a small town in New York State where he shot a number of films, that there was a quality of light there, particularly at twilight, that I have never found elsewhere. It was transcendently illuminative for moving pictures. Griffith and his cameraman, Billy Bitzer, were not only influenced by the beauty of their native land, they were also influenced strongly by 19th century American painters of the Hudson River School and by painters of the West like Albert Bierstadt. What Barbara Rose has written about Bierstadt can be equally applied to Griffith, that his landscape panoramas were marked by sunsets, great streaming rays of light blazing from a distant background, misty mountain peaks and exaggerated scale. We can only refer to it as the mystical vision of divine immanence in natural phenomena. Other comments of Rose's about other of the American landscape painters are also applicable to Griffith. She discusses the work of Edward Dickinson and others and finds in their work landscape used as a point of departure for expressing inner states of emotion. Light has always been an important metaphor for divine illumination, and it remains so in American landscape painting. A sense of something larger than human scale, both literally and metaphysically, permeates this work. Thus, Griffith's debt to the traditions of his native art was both thematic, pastoral serenity that intimated the golden age, light as a metaphor for goodness, and also practical, as evidenced by the interest in finding in shades of light symbolic equivalents for inarticulate emotions. The last piece of film that is going to be shown tonight I thought was going to be a great surprise. It turns out that it's being shown either this week or next here. It's a film called Reefer Madness that was made sometime during the 30s and is perhaps the single best indication I know of 30s attitudes towards illegal narcotics. It's a fairly short clip, and it occurs when somebody is wondering where Bill or Bob or whoever his name is, who happens to be the hero of the film, is, and it turns out that he is at a party where people are smoking illegal drugs. And the action of the sequence, I think, will indicate, as I said, very well the attitudes of the 30s, or some part of the 30s, towards illegal drugs. Anything more can be said about that than is obvious from taking a look at it. I'm sorry that that it was cut off that abruptly. I'm pretty much done with what I've got to say. I don't know if anyone has any questions or not, or what the procedure here is, if I can.